Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to this session, Where Next in Digital Social Protection, Lessons from the COVID-19 Crisis Taken into the Future. Please do note that this session will be recorded and can be later found on sp.org. My name is Saurav Bhattarai, and I work at the GIZ's Global Initiative for Social Protection, Innovation, and Learning, and I will be your facilitator for today. Today's webinar is the fourth in the Aspects series that relies on a World Bank framework defining 4 building blocks of adaptive social protection systems. In this series, we aim to bring experts and practitioners together and foster exchange on a global level. Today's webinar is situated within the 4th building block, data and information. We are very glad to have our two co-organizers, Oxford Policy Management and socialprotection.org, on board today. Now let's move to the content of today's session. Today we'll be talking about digital social protection during the COVID crisis, but we will also look ahead, asking ourselves, how do we use the capacity that has been built and incorporate the lessons learned from responding to the COVID-19 crisis into the delivery of routine social protection and shock responsive social protection going forwards. To answer these questions, we've invited some guests, great and knowledgeable speakers for some presentations and then a panel discussion. To actively participate in this webinar, and particularly the panel discussion, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them during the event. To kick things off, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters. We have Alexandra Doyle, who's a consultant on poverty and social protection from Oxford Policy Management. We have Rodrigo Assumpcao, social protection management information systems specialist from the ILO. We have Jonathan Marskell, Senior Program Officer, Identification for Development Initiative at the World Bank. And Angelina Fisher, Adjunct Professor of Law, Director of Policy and Practice, New York University School of Law. And now I'd like to invite Alexandra to give us a framing for today's session. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thanks very much, Saurav. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for joining today. I'm going to start with a short presentation to set the scene before handing over to our panelists who'll be diving more deeply into the data building block that we'll be looking at today. So on the next slide, and this has been said many, many times before, but the COVID-19 crisis really has resulted in an unprecedented increase in social assistance responses across the world. This map shows how the vast majority of countries across Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia and the Pacific have implemented at least one social assistance measure to address the impacts of the pandemic, and in many countries have implemented several. And this large-scale response really is like no other. So due to the unique conditions of the crisis and its wide-reaching impact, it's resulted in quite a lot of innovations, some of which we want to look at today. So on the next slide, I'd like to start by looking at this representation by the space team. And if we start at looking at the cube that's in the center, which represents routine social protection, or in this case, social assistance, and the existing system and capacities that governments had prior to the pandemic. And this kind of cube or core was really the basis on which governments were able to expand support to people during the pandemic. And governments and countries had different strategies that they could use. So in some instances, they were able to increase the adequacy of support by increasing the amount in light of greater needs during the shock. In some instances, they could increase coverage by reaching people not routinely covered by social assistance programs. And in others, they were able to expand comprehensiveness to address new risks. And this all took place in a context where there was a need to act quickly before people start to resort to using negative coping strategies. And so timeliness was crucial. Other principles that countries tried to follow were being cost effective, providing support that was predictable or that it allowed people to plan, implementing responses that were accountable, so being transparent and clear, responses that were equitable and inclusive, ensuring that no one is left behind, and especially those that are most vulnerable and often least connected to formal systems. And ideally implementing these responses in a manner that is sustainable. And what we've learned throughout this response is that existing systems and existing capacities that were in place for routine social assistance has been one of the main enablers of the response across the countries. And countries with well-developed systems and well-developed capacity were able to respond quite effectively. So the diagram on the next slide represents this kind of core system. And this is what Space has been calling the social protection solar system. And it helps us to think about the core in the system in several different layers. So the first is looking at policies. And these are the policies that are in place to support a swift response. These policies can relate to financing, they can relate to coordination of the response, how different actors work with each other. They can relate to legal and policy frameworks that support the response and stipulate mandates and roles and responsibilities, and also kind of functional and technical capacities. Then the next layer is around the design aspects, which starts with assessing the needs of people and understanding the risk profiles of different people. And this is really a crucial step to ensure that the design of programs can reach the right people, can provide the right amount of money and for the right amount of time. And then in the final layer, there are also the delivery mechanisms that support all of this. So starting with outreach and communications about programs and interventions, registering people, and then providing support and managing people that are part of the program. And thinking about this outer layer, on the next slide, we can look at the World Bank sourcebook visual, which shows kind of what it takes to deliver social assistance programs from the beginning, right from assessing and identifying people right through the intervention. And today, what we want to focus on is some of these gateway functions. So looking at outreach, intake, and registration. And this was particularly interesting in the COVID context, where there was really a massive increase in the number of people that needed support and that needed support quickly. And therefore, countries face a need to rapidly expand their capacity to take people into these types of programs. And what we want to focus on here is some of the digital innovations that we've seen in relation to these functions. Recognizing that digital innovations were not implemented in all cases, and of course that there were also digital solutions that were integrated across the delivery chain, as shown in this graphic. The use of mobile money payments being a big one, but also for grievance and case management and other functions. And what's interesting about the COVID crisis is that the unique conditions, and particularly the need to implement responses whilst limiting the risk of contagion, have led to a lot of innovations, and particularly in terms of using remote methods, which can really be facilitated by implementing digital tools into delivery. So on the next slide, this graph draws on data from the IPC-IG dashboard. And what you can see here is the different strategies that were used for identifying potential participants in these programs. And highlighted in the yellow bars is different strategies that relate to the use of existing data. So for countries, the quickest option for extending coverage was using existing information systems and existing databases. And this really played a crucial role in the response. What we saw is that countries drew on social security data, on social registry data, which was very common in Latin America and the Caribbean, where these registries are much better developed, on informal worker registries, civil registry data, as was the case in Namibia, or using data on waiting lists for programs, as was the case in Zambia. And this has really shown that there's a really important and crucial role that existing data can play in rapidly reaching new people and expanding support. And on the next slide, what we want to say is that data obviously only covers those people who are already in the system. And so while it can be, using existing data can be a quick and first line of response and a good way to reach many people, in many cases, the use of existing data also needs to be complemented with other means of reaching people. And this is what we saw. So countries wanting to leverage existing data struggled with a range of issues. And that's what we're calling preconditions here. So in order to use data for an effective response, data needs to be current and maintained. So in Indonesia and the Philippines, although they had developed social registries, the data was last updated in 2015 and didn't cover everybody in need. And so this made it difficult to solely rely on social registry data for the response. Data also needs to be relevant in terms of helping countries to identify the right people. So having data on people's socioeconomic conditions, and also having data to reach people. So data for delivery, including contact information or data that can help with payments. And finally, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be trusted, secure, and it needs to be private. And in many countries, existing information systems didn't tick all of these boxes. And that's particularly in relation to having adequate coverage of the affected population. So this meant that several countries established other mechanisms to collect data or complemented existing data with new registration and outreach mechanisms. And you can see this in the graph on the next slide. So this yellow bar shows the scale of these open registration or new enrollment campaigns that took place across many of the interventions in these three regions. And this also included on-demand approaches, which was something that was quite rare prior to COVID-19. And this was most common in Africa and Asia, while Latin America and the Caribbean relied a bit more on social registries because these databases were better developed. But as I mentioned before, the scale of the shock, the wide-reaching consequences, and the need to reach a lot of people very quickly meant that many countries also opted for more universally leaning approaches, and this was facilitated by using on-demand mechanisms. On the next slide, the graph shows some of the tools that we use to facilitate on-demand registration or other types of enrollment campaigns and how these were operationalized in practice. So what we see with the red bars is that many of these mechanisms were in fact digital. So for example, in South Africa and Namibia, people were enrolled into social assistance programs in just a couple of weeks using web platforms or USSD short codes or WhatsApp. And the data that was collected could then be cross-checked against other registries, including national ID databases, to validate the data that they were collecting. In Latin America and the Caribbean, automatic registration was also quite common. But that said, we also saw quite a lot of use of more traditional approaches, and this is highlighted on the next slide. So here you see a lot of manual self-registration and manual registration through outreach. And this was particularly the case in many African countries where census sweeps or door-to-door data collection took place. But again, even here, we see that there were some digital innovations in terms of being able to prioritize certain areas or districts for coverage using satellite imagery to identify pockets of greater need and then prioritize these areas for census sweep approaches. And in general, countries were combining these strategies to collect new data with existing data. So for example, using social registries or on-demand registration data, and then drawing on other bases to target out people. So in Pakistan, people were able to register using an SMS short code or web platform. And then the government was able to identify people who were not eligible for the program by making linkages to the tax system, government employee records, records around international travel, for example. Of course, using these types of approaches also requires sufficient levels of digital literacy and access to digital tools to ensure that a response is really inclusive and caters to the needs of everyone. And that's why in many cases we see these complementary approaches combining digital tools and manual registration. So on the final slide, we can see that this experience has brought us to a turning point in terms of digital delivery and social protection. And what we want to look at today is how data and information systems enabled this large increase of intake and enrollment. And we want to ask ourselves a few questions about where this leaves us going forward. So how do we learn from the COVID-19 response and build some of the innovations that we've seen into routine social protection? But also, how do we build on these lessons for future responses to both idiosyncratic shocks that can affect people at different stages of the life cycle, and people might require support at different stages, and also building these into responses to less predictable covariate shocks that can have broad effects and also require mass registration, as we've seen in the case of COVID-19. And distilling these lessons will help to ensure that we have better informed responses in the future. So we've already seen some countries taking steps to enable greater integration of digital platforms into social protection. For example, in South Africa is taking steps to amend legislation to allow for online applications to social assistance programs, where previously only face-to-face enrollment was allowed. Pakistan has integrated the SMS short code that was used for enrollment into the second phase of the emergency cash transfer, but has also used it as part of updating the National Social Registry. And some countries are taking the data that they collected during the response and feeding it into databases and information systems to improve coverage of the systems. And so today we'll draw on some of these experiences and reflect on how data and information systems can be used in routine and shock responsive social protection, but also reflect on some of the challenges and how to build inclusive systems, and also to ensure that the data systems and the databases that we have and that support delivery are also inclusive. So with this background, I'd like to hand back to Saurav and our panelists to dive further into some discussion around foundational data systems and how they can support the delivery of social protection in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And as you said, to learn more about what foundational systems are required to support digital delivery within with a specific focus on the importance of identification systems, I'd like to invite Jonathan for his presentation. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Saurav. Let me start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to speak in this webinar and to come back, actually. On the screen in front of you, you're going to see a relatively complex diagram called a digital stack. And if there's two things I would like for you to get from this, my presentation, is the concept of a digital stack and the concept of digital public infrastructure. And you'll see here at the bottom of this stack is digital identity. It could be argued that data is a layer below that, and obviously connectivity, digital skills and literacy, and the institutions, etc. But really looking at the tools that facilitate presenceless, cashless, paperless transactions, it begins at the digital ID layer. Now, we've seen with the COVID-19 response, and it was presented very nicely by Alexandra earlier, that countries had to scramble to find the missing middle and various parts at the bottom and the top who were not in existing databases. Through a foundational ID system, which is intended to have universal access, it's not going to give you all of the data that you need to deliver social protection, nor any 99% of services, but it will give you the base, it will make the job tremendously easier. And therefore, as a result, we've seen a great impetus across all regions, many countries, for new momentum around the digital identity agenda, because they recognize just as how much of a gap existed with respect to identifying and verifying the population. And the positioning of ID as a key pillar of resilience, of adaptation, of crisis response is a good one. And so with this diagram here, above digital identity, you see consented data sharing. Once you link data, once you link a person's digital identity to data about them, they can consent to its sharing and use. It requires a whole infrastructure for data exchange, like service buses or an X-road type exchange layer. But immediately you begin to empower individuals with greater agency over their data. I've seen personally in a number of countries, the data exists in various systems, but there are legal and procedural bottlenecks to using that data. These are fair, but to overcome those, one of the avenues is to get the consent of the individual. And without the systems in place to do this sufficiently, and I don't mean paper forms where people sign to give their consent, it becomes too difficult. Above that layer is the payments interoperability. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this. There's far better experts than I on this. But when you see how these, what's important is that alone these layers do have value, but together when they work seamlessly, when they're designed with APIs that link them, when the processes are complementary, when the standards are common, you unlock the ability to do a lot of new transactions. You'll see three examples there. First is in the financial sector. Of course, there's the famous case of Aadhaar in India, which contributed to increasing financial inclusion from 35% to 80% in 6 years. But going further and more relevantly to this conversation, when Thailand had to lock down the economy earlier this year in response to COVID, they introduced a program called No One Left Behind. It was a payment for 5,000 baht, roughly $200, that was to be delivered over 3 months. Initially, it was planned to cover only a few million people. They built a website in a matter of days. The website was integrated with the national ID system, and the verification literally was just like a credit card. You have a 3-digit number on the back of your card. You enter demographic information. You enter the number on the back of the card, and they matched your demography with what was in the national ID system. Then they went through a process of cross-checking this data against various registries, farmer registry, bond holding, social security members who are formal workers and thus entitled to care under that program. And within a few days and weeks, they reached 24 million applications. And in the end, roughly 15.3 million were eligible for these payments. The program was not perfect. It had problems and challenges, but the fact that this could be delivered in a matter of days and weeks, and the payment was delivered through the prompt pay interoperability of the financial sector. It was delivered to bank accounts that were linked to the national ID number of beneficiaries. It reduced a lot of the administrative costs, the transaction costs. The fact that the ID number is linked to a bank account, it provided more integrity for the intended recipient of the funds. And then there's the famous case of Estonia, where 99%, actually more, of their transactions can be done completely online. Moving forward, we see, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of momentum around the digital identity agenda. But of course, with this comes the need to strengthen data protection, cybersecurity, and even inclusion safeguards, because people that are excluded from what is intended to be a universal ID system will be excluded from social protection systems programs, whether those are targeted or universal. The World Bank, through my program, Identification for Development, we're supporting countries to address those gaps, to build ID systems, to build in the necessary safeguards. There's some exciting projects, for example, the Philippine identification system in Togo. They had a lot of success with the Novisi program. using the voter registry, but now they're moving to a universal foundational ID system with support from the bank. So there's a lot of exciting developments. I think as a final takeaway, I would say that it's important to do what we're calling the paradigm shift. ID systems traditionally have been systems for registering people so the government can know who they are, where they are, essentially as a system of administration or control. That paradigm shift is shifting from that approach to digital identity as a tool for empowering people and a platform for service delivery. Sometimes a challenge here is the institutional home of the system. Sometimes it's the design of the system. Sometimes it's the legal framework. But with this stack philosophy, looking at ideas as something on which other applications can be built, hopefully will increase momentum around this. And you can look at examples like the India stack. In Singapore, where I'm based, there is the National Digital Identity Stack. The way Thailand has linked identity and payments, similar in Chile, South Africa is doing this, is very exciting. I'll stop there. Thank you, Saurav.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, our next speaker will speak about the data that can be used for the outreach, intake, and registration, but also about what we have learned in the crisis regarding data use, governance, and protection from the COVID-19 response, and what this means for using data to deliver social protection going forward. For this, I'd like to give the floor to Rodrigo from the ILO. Over to you, Rodrigo. You are muted, Rodrigo. I can't hear you. I can see that you are speaking. No, still cannot hear you. Now, can you unmute now? Maybe. Unfortunately not. But yes, exactly. So our next, so we're going to change the order of speakers, but our next speaker will highlight some of the risks and challenges associated with increasing data sharing and interoperability, and discuss some of the mitigation measures that can be used to ensure that greater digitalization does not come at the expense of data protection, security, or privacy. Angelina, for this, I would hand over to you.
Great.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Rodrigo, but let's continue with Angelina as she's already ready to start.
It's all right. I don't mind. It's entirely up to you. If whatever makes sense, and then I'm happy to let Rodrigo go. I'll go after.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Then Rodrigo, just take it away.
Hey, let's hope there are no more glitches. I mean, it's obligatory. Ever since Bill Gates had that problem launching Windows, every discussion about IT, somebody has to blunder with technology, and I guess I lucked out. So I'll share my screen and hope for the best. Now, can you still hear me? And can you see the screen?
Yes, both.
Okay, great. Okay, so this first slide I brought was to remind us that even before 2019 and even before the pandemic seemed like to reinvent our field in a sense, we were already discussing all of these issues that we are discussing here. The International Social Security Agency had listed 10 challenges, 5 of which are here: the digital economy and evolving labor markets, the health and long-term care, closing the coverage gap, protection of migrant workers, rising public expectations, and they had already listed digital transformation responses for these challenges. So they were talking about data-driven design for new social security schemes. They were talking about the use of analytics, big data, and IoT, Internet of Things for health and long-term care. They were talking about integrated mobile data systems. They were talking about international data exchange, which is something many countries have been involved for over 20 years. And this whole discussion of standards and data exchanges always come up very intensely in this context. And they were talking about proactive and mobile-based systems that would give answers to the rising public expectations. When all that was happening, this went into overdrive when the pandemic got rid, or perhaps not got rid, but temporarily suspended many of the objections and the bottlenecks to some of the needs and some of the actions that were happening to overcome this. Now, when you talk about where next, there are some starting points that I would like to stress here. First, when we talk about digital transformation, and especially we have to deal with people like myself and people who have been doing some kind of work in IT for long. And I always joke with them and with the audiences I speak to, is that the problem is that technology has become too important to be left in the hands of IT people. Sometimes we don't speak common language, we use jargon, and we try to put our own IT objectives in front of the institutional and the policy objectives. And that is a huge mistake. Technology must serve the organizational needs and not the reverse. And digital transformation is always about making choices, tough choices. It's a constant balancing act of trade-offs that you have to choose. And this is something you have to be aware. The upside of that is that since it's a continuous process, the choices will present themselves again, and you will be able to come back to some of the things you left behind and renew their importance and renew your actions in order to reach those goals. Social protection organizations, social security organizations, they need to decipher their ICT and data operations. Otherwise, we run the risk of being devoured by growing budgetary demands and diminishing results. Because if on one hand, effective service delivery capacity comes really from harnessing ICT, technology, and your data, it's not enough. It is not sufficient. You also need comprehensive and well-made, well-structured social protection policies. And you also need adequate financing. Only the combination of these three elements, effective delivery through technology mostly, good policy, and adequate financing, that is the three legs that can sustain social protection for all. And we have always to remember that technology is not capable of solving policy problems. And it does not reach everybody without conscious effort. Usually, once we implement digital transformation, we are better off than the situation beforehand. But that does not mean at all that a miracle has happened and we have reached the end of our efforts and everybody is reached, connected, and protected. We have to keep on struggling and trying to find those excluded, to find those that were not brought into the system and reach out to them. And once we deal with the majority that technology allows us to, that will hopefully free more resources, both financial and human, in order for us to reach out for more people. Definitely, data protection and data security is a crucial, important element. But when we talk about that and we join it up with data privacy, we have always to remember that in most lower income and developing countries, the data privacy has still to be balanced with the right to be recognized by public policy. And to be recognized by public policy means that you need to have sometimes your data transacted, recognized, and existing within the government systems. But the main point of this conversation here is that digital transformation is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a journey of constantly learning how to do better in order to do more. And again, we have to see that in data, the answer to that riddle about harnessing your IT is usually implementing adequate governance and management policies and processes. And in data, this is absolutely crucial. Everywhere data is being collected, it's being processed, it's being analyzed, it's being used, it's being reused, and it's even being commercialized. And within the public context, that poses many, many challenges. There are people already talking about data wars. There are instances where the possibility of capturing and harnessing data gives a level of competitive advantage that we have not seen before. And this is even threatening democratic institutions. But in social protection, which is a body of public policy that is at once responsible for a huge chunk of what I like to call the national data infrastructure. This is fundamental. Data and information are the fundamental assets of social protection institutions. That's what enables us to make decisions, to operate, to act within our context. And it is a strategic public asset. It's part of this national data infrastructure, which is as important for our societies as physical infrastructure, as roads and ports and telecom lines. The data infrastructure enables society to function. And we are in a phase of structuring this, learning the rules and learning how to structure this for common good, hopefully. The processes and policies involving data have to be defined, and many social protection institutions need then to put in place a master data management process in order for them to understand the constituting elements of the data they possess, or rather of the data that they are custodians of, in order for them to operate, to share, to exchange, and to be custodians of this asset, which does not belong to them, but to society as a whole. They have to focus on data quality. That was very clear in many of the lessons learned from all the COVID initiatives that were mentioned here. The focus on improving constantly the quality of your data brings important results that need to be harnessed. Of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we adopt international standards and best practices. We partner with multiple institutions in order to use and share data, and this is crucial. For social protection institutions, sometimes we have this idea that we have to harness our data only for ourselves. And in this context, and COVID showed that, if we don't share our data will be shared without our say, without our capacity to impact. So understanding the data, being able to share this data will allow us to determine how this is going to happen. And of course, in order to constantly improve our operations, we have to implement data-driven management process, where the data will determine some of the choices we make and determine how we will improve our operations. Gathering, preserving, using, analyzing, and sharing data, in my opinion, is the main role of information and communication technologies within social protection. And then we have this nice little image of digital transformation. And we have this picture of Mondrian on the screen with everything very well structured with right angles. And it's a beautiful picture. It's worth lots of money. But sometimes that's not where we end up. Often digital transformation might have the appearance of the Jackson Pollock here. The Pollock painting, which is also a beautiful painting and also worth a lot of money. And you can have aesthetic preferences for both. But the point here is that sometimes what you end up with can be perfectly functional, perfectly adequate for your structure, as long as it is understood and purposeful in terms of its intention and its results. So as the final message, I'd like to present these three concepts that within the digital transformation, the continuous process that you are undergoing, you have to discuss the role and implement and encourage the role of innovation. You have to have innovation processes that you can bring in the new, test it, establish its worth, advance its implementation, and redo it often, incorporating, of course, as always, when we innovate, the possibility of error, and transform the possibility of error into something that can then harness not only the creativity, but the innovation process in itself as a learning process, as a feedback process that will then be fed back into your actions. Secondly, that we belong not only as governmental institutions in many cases, but institutions that are struggling to help society in general. We are talking about a digital ecosystem that we are building part of, and we are going to inhabit this digital ecosystem. So a digital transformation process is not an isolated process for a social protection institutions. We have to interact with the ecosystem that we are creating just by doing this exercise of digital transformation. So we have to interact with other actors that are doing this. And lastly, concerning specifically data, we have to prepare our data for systems and processes that are still to be created. We do not know what our data is going to be used for in the future, but we do know now. We have learned and we have seen the examples that this data will be used in the future. So it has to be built and structured in a very flexible way that will be available for future uses that we do not have yet determined. And we have to have the means to reprocess and repurpose this data, both technically as well as the contractual, the agreements, the permissions, the acceptance of this use constantly. We have to structure our databases in preparation for our future. This is where I'd like to leave at, and I hope we can get more out of this during the debate. Thank you, Saurav.
Sure, thank you, Rodrigo. And with that, I'd hand over to Angelina for discussing some of the mitigation measures that can be used to ensure that greater digitalization does not come at the expense of data protection, security, or privacy. Over to you, Angelina.
Thank you. I'm so glad I let Rodrigo go first, because I feel like this will flow very naturally from his discussion, which I enjoyed very much. I want to, in a way, this is a nice bookend to cap the introduction that Alex had given by, in a way, presenting a different way of how I think we should think about social protection. And it's, as the slide suggests, I think we should think about social protection, particularly digital social protection, as infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? Well, my colleagues here from NYU Law School and University of Buenos Aires have defined infrastructures as these dynamic and systemic networks and assemblages that are built at varying scale with spatial fixity. They instantiate both shaping and changing social and technical relations. They're embedded in legal organizations and social technical practices, and they're relational, and so they're experienced differently by different people. And why do I think we should think of social protection in that way? Because I think, it allows us to see certain features of social protection as infrastructure. And one of these features is that infrastructure is embedded, and it's, as I think already been pointed out, it's embedded and it's connected to existing legacy systems, both technical systems like software and databases, but also organizational systems, so the institutional structures and policy decision processes, and legal practices and frameworks. And then, of course, once these infrastructures are built, they also in turn shape all those practices as well. So, for example, the proliferation of digital IDs and digitization of government systems have spurred or often been accompanied by, especially when financed by the World Bank, by a particular framework or particular model of data protection laws and privacy laws. So you see how these infrastructures then in turn shape the legal landscape within which they operate. The other important feature is that they're relational. So they bring into life and they shape these social relations, technical relations. So for example, automated eligibility determination may define and redefine our ideas of vulnerability. Choices of data to create identity authentication for digital IDs may reify specific features of identity while making others invisible. And those relationships will in turn, those choices, will in turn change the relationships between different actors involved in that infrastructure. And those changes can be purposeful and engineered, planned, but sometimes they're non-engineered and unplanned. When the next feature I think that's important is that the different experience of infrastructure by different actors. So government worker entering data that will determine eligibility may see this as a kind of a technical process, that it's an instrument of efficiency. The person on the other end who gets excluded because they're determined to be ineligible will experience the same infrastructure as hunger or homelessness or a loss of a lifeline. And I put these features, which I think have become central to the emerging digital protection systems, in part to illustrate how the social practices, the organizational practices, and the legal frameworks play a role at each of these stages, right? So it's not just the data protection laws or the privacy or their existence and not existence, but contracts, procurement regimes. They will shape how the digital infrastructures are designed, what choices that would make mean for how data is formed or in what way it's aggregated or who can access it, who controls the APIs, to what extent, and so forth. So I think it's important to think about these as very much interlinked and co-constitutive. And once built, infrastructures have durability. So limited resources and capabilities and high switching costs and entrenched legacies and often the overall complexity render infrastructures less malleable to change. So they may complicate future regulations of infrastructures as well. So the design and construction of infrastructures requires deliberate and forward planning. And I think that echoes some of the points Rodrigo had just made. So we often think of social protection in a way, the slide by Jonathan encapsulated very much how we often think of infrastructure, which is a kind of a technical system that, and I think the key I wanted to emphasize, the key element in that slide was the idea of personless, as if the thing exists in and of itself. The idea is that technical design and data and algorithms are just going to work on their own. There will be no people involved. But of course, there are people involved at absolutely every stage in the way. And in fact, there are more people involved, and there are different people involved. There are software engineers involved and data scientists involved and commercial actors whose data often gets incorporated into the systems, and who often, as in the case of Aadhaar, will also be given an opportunity to use the system to commodify people's data. So I think it's important to really keep in mind that people are often and very much present and are the ones making the different choices and are being affected by those choices as well. So I think this leads me to say to kind of an important point, which is that infrastructures and the social protection infrastructure in particular, they're not technical, or no, they're not just technical, they're deeply, deeply political. And they entail different interests and different publics. The choices regarding which data is collected and which is not, how it is organized and presented, how often it is maintained, who has access to it, for what purpose, will all affect how infrastructure impacts the different publics and the extent to which it reflects certain interests and obfuscates others. And the power to make a lot of these choices in these infrastructures is now dispersed. And it's dispersed and often concentrated in the hands of those who control the relevant components of the infrastructures. And in the context of social protection, I think it's important to remember that interest in efficient allocation of resources and financial accountability historically has created pressures for identification and elimination of double dippers, fraudulent registrations, those who are not the absolutely most deserving. And I think we have to see the move to digital infrastructure and the proliferation of these integrated database as embedded in that political economy. So the ability to integrate beneficiary data from different sources can enable not just the removal of fraudulent people, but also in removing those who may be subject to several different programs in a way of further what I would like to call engage in precision development, to find the absolutely the most the deserving. And these ideas of vulnerability then, particularly as they are determined through data mining, they become dynamic. So it also makes it very difficult to form contestation and solidarity around them. A colleague of mine, Dimitri Vandermeersch, at Edinburgh University, has a paper where he makes similar argument with digital border control. When you're relying on aggregated data to mine various data sources that are aggregated together to mine, to create predictions of who is eligible or not who is eligible, and often that will entail machine learning algorithms that will learn and constantly shift and change the factors that go into and determining vulnerability, thus redefining it, makes it really difficult to coalesce for those who get impacted, and also makes it really difficult to invoke legal frameworks. For example, the right to non-discrimination, because you're no longer being discriminated just on the defined legal categories of protected groups, but along other factors that are now the ones forming the determination of vulnerability and deciding who to include and who to exclude. And so I think it's important to remember this political economy and to think forward, that to make sure that we're not creating surveillance apparatuses that will ultimately be used to reduce welfare budgets and narrow beneficiary pool. And on the other hand, as has been, there's a great report by my colleagues at the AI Now Institute on regulating biometric that very nicely illustrates the ways in which the Aadhaar system, which often is sort of used as a flagship digital ID model, has really led to very extractive practices and has allowed the commercial sector to commodify the data to the detriment of the people. And on the social protection side, has led to massive exclusions and hunger and even instances of starvation. So where do we go from there? I think if we think about digital social protections as infrastructure, we have to be forward planning. We can't be reactive, and we can't see it as a kind of a closed system in isolation. We have to recognize the extent to which it is embedded in the political economy, in the social practices, and in the legal frameworks. We have to pay attention to distributive effects of the system, and particular attentiveness to different publics and the different experiences that are involved with this particular infrastructure. I think the other thing is that infrastructures are often invisible. They recede into the background until they break down. So we don't notice the roads we're driving on until there are potholes on it. And the same thing with that digital social protection system and digital ID systems. They often become normalized until there is an outbreak, until there is a scandal. And I think the digital systems in particular, when so many choices are embedded in the technical design, the non-transparency of the power dynamics is particularly problematic. And so resurfacing or thinking of ways to make visible ways in which choices behind the infrastructures have been made is important. And then I think the last piece is creating the spaces for contestation and solidarity building. I think it's really important, and I was glad to see on Alexandra's slide before the mechanism for remedies as being envisioned as part of the system, but I think it's even more than that. It's the idea of bringing these issues up for political debate and contestation, and the ability of the communities to ensure that it's not just that their data rights or privacy protections are respected, but that their autonomy is not compromised, that their collective public welfare is not subsumed by other interests. So on this, I will end, but I look very much forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Angelina. And thank you to all the speakers. We've now come to the time of our panel discussion. So I'd ask all the speakers to turn on their cameras again. We'll be taking questions from all participants. So if you haven't already, please do ask them in the Q&A section of Zoom. I'll start with a question that's received a lot of support from the audience already, and it's about data sharing and consent. So I'll read out the question. We can all probably all agree that data is and will continue to be important for delivering social protection programs, but that obtaining consent for data sharing is sometimes neither fully informed nor meaningful, given that people are vulnerable and need access to these services. I was therefore wondering what safeguards our panelists think are possible or required to prevent governments from using data to exclude certain groups, while also allowing for data sharing to support service delivery. Who would like to take a first go with this?
Okay, I will. Thanks, Saurav. It's a really good question. Before I begin, I just want to clarify one point. Angelina mentioned my slide said personless transactions. It said presenceless, the ability to do a transaction without being physically present, like we are on Zoom now, presenceless. Just to respond to this question though, first and foremost, it starts obviously with having a legal framework, but not just the legal framework for data protection, but the institutions and the other features around rule of law, for example, that allow for the and capacity that allow for the enforcement and supervision of the implementation of that law. Second is to have institutions in place that allow for people to raise grievances, complaints, and for accountability around those processes, as well as accountability for the organizations or institutions that may have misused data. Third is transparency. So things like transparency portals where people can access who's seeing their data, why, when, etc. Transparency in terms of informing the individual more actively, not just relying on them accessing a portal. Transparency in terms of making clear, even publishing the source code. A number of countries, for example, use open source software, and they allow for the community to review that. the standards that are followed, the processes, the manuals that underpin all these processes as well. Then in terms of data, and I really enjoyed Rodrigo's presentation. I think there is a tendency, unfortunately, for countries to try and centralize data, whereas actually we should be moving towards federation or even decentralization of data. What does this mean? It's never worked in the history of technology to create a database that would cover so many different things. What is needed is databases that have minimal data that can talk to each other or that are interoperable and can exchange data. And a federation is essentially that. But a step further is decentralization, when data can be stored on personal devices, whether it's a personal cloud or a smart device or something that the person has, and for this data to be portable and verifiable and essentially to be trusted as if it becomes from a central registry. And the good news is that there's a lot of technologies now, particularly around cryptography, that facilitate this, as well as standards. There's some other technologies and approaches that are needed. For example, zero knowledge proof. So if I'm entering a bar and they want to know if I'm 18 years old, I don't need to show them my driving license. They just need to know that I'm over 18. So using these practices as well when it comes to targeting and processing applications for social protection, so you don't get the full suite of data. It's just whether certain conditions are met. But fundamentally, and I think this goes to what Angelina was saying, is there's always got to be an analog process as well, whether it's for those people who cannot use or access digital processes, or when the systems don't work, which also happens very often. Just happened to Rodrigo, having the processes in place that can be backup, that are accessible and have the same effect as the digital ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Rodrigo, Angelina, would you want to add to that?
Sure. It's funny that the way we fixed the problem was the same way Bill Gates did. He rebooted the system, right? So I got in and I got off. My problem with the way Stephanie wrote this question is that I get really anxious when we don't hold governments to the same standards we hold the private sector. So governments can't access the data, or we should be afraid of governments being able to access the data, but we are perfectly comfortable to share our data with the pharmacy on the corner in exchange for some kind of discount on the price of toothpaste. Or when we go to the supermarket and we basically tell all we consume and at what levels and everything about our personal lives through consumption, and this can be shared and very difficult to regulate, and nobody really gets into that. But there's this whole fear of government. Well, I come from a country that, even though we had more than our share of military dictatorships, I'm more afraid of the private sector than I am of the government. I have to admit. And so that's the first thing I'd like to say. I think the discussion is not limited to governments, right? We are discussing in this context, but I am much more afraid of what the private sector is doing with my data than I am with what governments are doing. The right to be recognized in governments is still, and if they want to exclude people, well, usually the best way for a government to exclude people is not registering them, is not enrolling them in whatever database, be it ID or be it social protection. That is usually the best way. So I'm a bit conflicted with this, because technically I am very skeptical of our technological capabilities of providing privacy. Jonathan was pointing the way of the future, and I think he's a bit more optimistic than I am in terms of the applicability, the immediate applicability of the technology he mentioned, because we still haven't overcome one hurdle, which is the fact that all this data can be copied when we use it. So even if we have cryptography and all that, this moment when our personal data will only exist within personal devices controlled by us is still in the future of science fiction. And I think that will be the only time when we will get back to the concept, the technical possibility of having the concept of privacy back. So until that happens, it's the struggle that Angelina's conversation was leading. It's a struggle of the social practices that will try to harness a very powerful energy and dynamic, which is pointing us away from privacy, which is pointing us away from the possibility of controlling how our data is used and shared. That does not mean the struggle she pointed out is less important. No, it probably means it is more. But we also have to understand the technical limitations, because both social practices, and especially the consolidation of that under law, lags many, many years behind the actual technological practices that are happening. So the forward thinking that she ended her slide is definitely one of the most important aspects of this discussion. And some of the safeguards Jonathan again has mentioned, and we're going to have to keep on doing it. But the point I'd like to make is that countries that have not done anything in terms of digital transformation are not better off in terms of protecting the rights of their citizens. So we have to look at all the problems that digital transformation brings, but not with the idea that going back to the past would put us in a better solution. Not only that's not going to happen, that is not a better position, in my opinion.
Yeah, if I might add to this, I think on the issue of consent, I think it's meaningless in this context, to tell you the truth. You know, what does it mean to consent or not if your livelihood depends on it? So on the one, so I think that's one. And two is that I think it's true that this, I mean, of course, it's important to focus on, you know, individual rights and autonomy and so forth. But there is a kind of almost excessive prioritization of data protection rights over collective rights and public interest. And I think that's in a way a misreading of the sort of the human rights regime, which we haven't talked about yet at all, but which of course looms large over the debate over social protection, is that it's not just about individual rights, it's also about collective rights and rights to economic redistributions and so forth. And so I think that has to be sort of the backdrop of this. And then I think the other, I completely agree with Rodrigo and sort of his point about you know these we're neither better off in a completely analog solution, nor are we sort of better off with these relying on these technological features as solving all these sort of isolated problems. And I think it's important to kind of be deliberative about these choices, about what lies between them, because the kind of system that Jonathan you envision is really expensive. I mean, to do well, it is really expensive, because my colleague Thomas Strines and I have just written a paper called Confronting Data Inequality, where we actually wrote it as a background paper for the World Bank Development Report. But the idea we examine there is the unequal distribution of data. Not just in terms of who has the data and who doesn't, but who decides what data is relevant and gets collected and what doesn't. And a lot of the government capacity to collect the kind of data that is often required for these social registries and social protection systems, the governments often don't have. And so they end up turning to the private sector. They end up turning to open data that might feature as proxies. And even then, when they collect, even if they're able to use that data, and often it is subject to various terms and conditions that are in contracts that they enter into with third parties, that data needs to be constantly updated, because it's not if it's not updated, I think as Alexandra emphasized early on, it results in inequitable outcomes. And so this kind of it's a huge investment to maintain this and to do this properly. You know, by linking it to other databases, you assume that the other databases are being updated as well and are complete. And so in a way, this kind of leaving it all to sort of this automated API governed system, I think will lead us in a situation where actually the studies that are coming out most recently from digital protection, and I put the link for an event that my colleagues are holding tomorrow looking at the case of Colombia, show that all this narrative about digital transformation in this particular way leading to financial inclusion or better outcomes are very much deserve to be questioned. There, you know, the degree of exclusion actually, and the degree of commodification that we see coming out of these systems, I think ought to give us pause. So I want to I maybe re-echo what Rodrigo says, is that we really have to be deliberative. And I think there is a kind of, and the sort of the language of the stack I find very interesting, because there's a kind of we've adopted the startup technology mentality of, like, you know, break fast, move fast, fix things as they go on, and I think it's in a way it's both contrary to the kind of coming as a lawyer sort of deliberative thinking that we're used to as lawyers at the very least are used to that, and from an international law perspective, I mean, just to kind of put social protection in the framework of human rights, I think we have to stop and think what this actually does to the rights of the people. So I just want to, I guess, highlight that it's the kind of this in between of, you know, going back to complete analog and just moving completely digital really needs to be a deliberative space.
Thank you, Angelina, and thank you, everyone. Very insightful discussion on a topic that it is very close to a lot of people, social protection practitioners, I assume. Let's move on to a very practical question that we have in the Q&A from Rawan Taha. After Alexandra's presentation on registration and assessment, there was a question on how is or how can double counting be prevented in data systems to support social protection better. Maybe Alexandra, you want to start us off with an answer for that?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, I mean, I think the short answer here is probably that there is a role for national ID systems, be those digital or not, or some type of unique identification in a country which can facilitate deduplication, especially when we have systems that are interoperable and that can speak to each other. And perhaps Jonathan and others can speak a bit more around the technicalities of this. But before I hand over, I also just wanted to note that there's also, you know, this also really depends on the design of the social protection system. So in some countries, it may be the case that individuals or households qualify for more than one type of support. That could be an old age pension or a child grant or a disability grant. And it might actually be intentional that governments want to layer support for households, and especially households that have multiple vulnerabilities. So I think just to say that systems are not always designed such that individuals or households are only eligible for one type of support. And perhaps it's really around governments knowing who is getting which support, rather than always wanting to deduplicate or kind of avoid against households getting multiple forms of support. But regardless, this can be facilitated by some type of unique identifier that can track individuals and households within this system. And the way in which that is used should really depend on the design. But then I'd like to hand over to other colleagues on the panel who might be able to bring a more kind of technical perspective on how this can take place, this type of tracking of unique identification. Thank you.
Jonathan, would you want to come in?
Sure. So, I mean, the first issue is the point that Alexandra raised, which is why would you want to deduplicate? I mean, if they're eligible for both sources of support, then so be it. But if there is a need to do this matching or deduplication or whatever it might be, of course, the use of a foundational ID can serve this purpose. One person has one identity. I'm not saying one ID number deliberately, because the use of a single unique identifier for multiple purposes actually comes with a lot of privacy and security risks when used in its raw form. There are methods like tokenization, for example, that can be used where you link to a single person, but using multiple different numbers. And these can be mapped to each other either through an algorithm, through a mapper, or some token vault, for example. There are solutions for that. And so that works. However, there are countries, obviously, where this is not the case. And the alternative is to use, for example, biometrics. We try to discourage the proliferation of biometric systems for the same privacy and security reasons. And then a lot of demographic information. But we've seen in the COVID response that this is also a challenge, because demographic deduplication depends on accurate data and lots of data. We worked on this in Vietnam, for example, where at least just under half of the population have the same surname, Nguyen. And many people, and there's not so many first names there, and many people born on the 1st of every month. So, there are challenges in this regard.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's another question from Dr. Talat in the chat, and also one remaining question. And if I may use the remaining 3 minutes that we have in the panel to get basically closing remarks from our panelists about, various countries who do want to go down the journey of digitalizing their systems are at very different different stages. So in your expert opinion, what is the starting point for governments that want to use data to support delivery in terms of social protection delivery, in terms of developing ID systems or developing MISs or databases? What is the starting point, and what would be, if you could give one to two sentence recommendations on what could be done, what would they be? I see Rodrigo on the top of my screen, so maybe we start with you, Rodrigo.
Sure. That allows me to come back a little bit, because I agreed so much with Angelina. I want to agree a little bit with Jonathan as well. I like his decentralized database vision, and I think that is the future. I come from a country that has no foundational ID, and we do everything by crisscrossing and matching widely different databases, and we've been doing it quite well for decades now. So it is possible, and the way to start, I think, contrary to the technical vision that Jonathan puts in terms of decentralized databases, I know of no country that has decentralized the policy of digital governance with success. That has to be centralized, because as it's a trade-off, as it's extremely expensive, as Angelina correctly put, you're going to have to make some very difficult, tough choices. And to start with, you're going to have to break the barriers for data sharing. So as the question was posed as a country and not as an individual social protection institution, the first thing I would do, I would establish a central point. It can be a ministry, it can be a special office, you can create an office, you can put it in the president's cabinet. It doesn't matter where you put it, but to have a central place where you analyze the planning and you control the budget allocated, so you get more connections, more sharing, and more bang for your buck, basically. So that's where I would start.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Angelina, Any thoughts from you?
So it's a really difficult question. I also wanted to address the question that was in the chat about lack of capacity and the partnership that often necessitates with the private sector. I think almost in every case, I'm going to go so far to say in every case, these kind of digital infrastructures necessitate partnerships with the private sector. The United States, a lot of our digital infrastructure for public authorities actually is outsourced to the private sector. But I think what is important in the context of the developing countries, developing economies in particular, is the leverage that over the private sector is actually even harder for the government to exercise. And so there's greater opportunities, not just of kind of corruption issues and things like that, but also on the other hand, just very predatory terms under which those and for digital infrastructures like social protection, that becomes really important, because if your software or data storage or analytic services are run by a private sector, as they often are, and they're not easily movable in a way, they're not portable very easily, or there isn't enough competition for services, you become beholden, you become locked in, and a huge part of the state's budget becomes dedicated to maintaining these infrastructures, or alternatively, they're just left to decay. And so you move away from the kind of, for example, the choices that necessitates making. You move away from the kind of regular maintenance of the data that you might have to less regular maintenance of the data, and then you can sort of see where things go from there. So I think it's again, like I don't know. And luckily, I don't have to make this choice, being privileged in the academia, of what exactly the government should do. I think it's really complicated. I think it's one really needs to, I think, place it within the political economy of a particular context. And I think, both Alex and Rodrigo have pointed out that countries are different. There are countries that there's some, in fact, foundational ID is not a common feature in the developed economies, just to put it out there. And they function. So in some instances, like there isn't a kind of a fit-all approach in a way. So the stack doesn't need to be the kind of model that becomes transplantable. Not every country is Estonia. Not every country is India. And for some different kind of digitization might work, different kind of design of that kind of infrastructure might be more appropriate. So I guess that's where I would start. I would start with planning, and I think the kind of centralized planning with some deliberative spaces is really where one starts, as opposed to trying to adapt a kind of model that was just not built for the specific context.
Thank you, Angelina. Jonathan, half a minute answer, because we still have one more speaker to go.
Okay, all right, I'll try to be very quick, but I'm very glad Angelina mentioned the US, because I lived in the US, and to live in a world where you use checks to pay rent, you need to show multiple documents to do any kind of business, is not really something that I look forward to. And I come from a country, Australia, where we don't have a national ID. My family migrated to Australia from the Soviet Union, and there's no foundational ID, and we have multiple problems with IDs. My grandmother is different names, different dates of birth in different databases. I do think, though, I do want to clarify one important thing, that the solution is not technology. Rodrigo's initial presentation, where he said it's not the IT people that need to drive this, it's the business people. I think that's absolutely essential. Technology is an enabler. If you digitize a process that sucks, you're going to have a digital process that sucks, right? So you need to reimagine how to do things better. Optimize resources for the 80%, so you can use the limited resources to help the remaining 20%. I also want to say that yes, I am optimistic, but that's also because I work with a bunch of awesome countries and awesome counterparts in East Asia and the Pacific, particularly my generation, the millennials. who really have a lot of passion, who have a lot of innovation, a lot of drive to do some of the things that we are talking about. I just want to also add, I fully endorse Rodrigo's point about the centralization of policy around digital governance. My advice for the social protection agenda is within ministries of social welfare or whatever these might be called, to create a central digital transformation or digital delivery, whatever you want to call it, unit, because one of the challenges we see consistently is that the organizations have their own silos, and to break these down, to integrate data, to integrate processes and systems is very important. I'm optimistic and I'm sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you all the speakers. And that brings us to the conclusion of the panel session. But now I want to invite my colleague from GIZ, Anita Mittal, to present an initiative that was launched this year to work on consensus-based standards and guidelines in the digital social protection space. Anita works for the Social Protection Innovation and Learning Program here at GIZ and has vast experience in the area of digital social protection. Anita, you have the floor and you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Saurav. Thanks for the opportunity to present and pitch the Convergence Initiative. So what we have heard from Alexandra is that when countries wanted to respond to the crisis caused with COVID, they all resorted to information systems. So we know that information systems are indispensable for delivery of social protection and achieving the vision wherever that anyone who wants social protection can get it. Social protection delivery systems are complex. It's not just one single system, but it involves multiple systems working together, like social registry, ID system, G2P system, as we saw in the stack approach, or we see in the Estonia's integrated architecture. And we have seen in case studies that integrated and interoperable social protection systems enable countries to respond well to adaptive situations where shock strikes, or for efficient delivery of social protection programs, which reduces both inclusion and exclusion errors, provides efficiency in administration and user experience. However, we have also seen that a lot of this potential of information system is yet to be realized, partly due to reinventing of the wheel, where we go through the same cumbersome process of developing the systems which are not interoperable. You can't have systems which are interoperable at the process level or at the data level, as Rodrigo mentioned, or at the technical level. Two systems don't interoperate, which really does not allow us to leverage the full value of an information system. So lots of these needs were felt, and stakeholders like World Bank, ILO, GIZ, ISA, ADB, and governments under the umbrella of USP 2030 converged to launch this Convergence Initiative, which was launched this September 15, 2021, with the aim of reaching consensus on standards and guidelines which can enable the development of interoperable information systems for social protection and foster an ecosystem for innovation, reduce time and cost for developing solutions, and allow countries to mix and match solid, robust, interoperable components. So what is the ask from our participants and panelists today is to support this process of consensus building on harmonization of standards, spread the awareness about the initiative, promote and adopt these standards and other guidelines and outputs produced from this initiative, and share feedback where it works well and where it does not. So we invite you to participate in the first phase of the project in 4 groups on principles, process standards, data standards, and technical standards. And the level of participation could be varied. It could involve just sharing of existing materials to reviewing the standards and guidelines that are produced, join discussions and share your thoughts, or even join in contributing to drafting of the standards and guidelines for this digital Convergence Initiative. You can write to us on the email being shared in the chat or follow us on the different channels for communications. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Please do reach out in the various channels if you want to engage in the Convergence Initiative. So that brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you for having made the time and staying the extra minute that we have gone over. And a special thank you to all our presenters, as well as our co-organizers, OPM and socialprotection.org. If you're interested in learning more or collaborating on the future, in the future, please do reach out to us. The video from this session, as well as the presentations and a summary of the discussions, will shortly be published at the webinar events page at sp.org. But we would also like to request you to take some time to fill out the survey to this webinar, as your feedback helps us to improve and pick up on topics that are relevant for you. We would really appreciate it if you could fill out the survey. And stay tuned for the upcoming webinar in our Aspects series. The next one will be on Thursday, February 17th, 2022, on another interesting topic in the field of social protection. Until then, I hope you have a very good rest of the day, week, and year. And yeah, see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.